I'd like to start with a question that Val's talk got me thinking about, which is, I wonder what you would say is a piece of information that you need, or policy that you'd like to see put in place from the other side. So as policymakers, what kind of research do you feel like needs to be done next? And as scientists, what kind of support for research do you think that there needs to be in order to make sure that there's more of an emphasis on the conservation of biodiversity and how we're addressing that? It's kind of a general question, so take it where you want it.
Very general question.
Okay, I'll start, just because I'm still buzzed up, so I can still talk. The thing that I see on the policy side, and I do really sit in the middle, but the thing that I see on the policy side that people don't have and they don't even know they need yet, but they will need it, is this business about, well, first of all, the relationships between different values or benefits, but then the effect of different kinds of action on those benefits. So the whole management action stuff. The world is full of sustainable forest management protocols that actually aren't very evidence-based, even in forestry, much less in terms of managing for these other benefits. There's information out there, but it's mostly not been synthesized. And so pulling that together in accessible forms, I think, is one of the things that's going to be needed. That was top of the head.
So you're saying that you don't necessarily need that more data needs to be collected, but there needs to be a better job of collating data and making it accessible?
I think both. I mean, we need to do a lot better at doing some of the things that people have done recently on assessing deforestation, things like protected area effectiveness using synthesized counterfactuals, instead of trying to do controlled experiments. Some creative ways of analyzing stuff we have already, but there are also things now that need to be studied in more depth, without question.
Yeah, I just wanted to take that a step further. So thinking about Steve's presentation, particularly with the Alto Mayo, I wanted to ask you, so to me, one of the things that I don't see in any of this is sort of an academic science requirement with respect to the red guarantees. So for instance, is there a research station going into the Alto Mayo that's actually going to help train Peruvians to do better monitoring? Because I think the real solution to me with respect to monitoring is expertise. And you've got to have local expertise. And so the question is whether that's built in at all. And I didn't hear anything that made me think it was.
So in terms of funding, there isn't a biological research station that's built into the funding for that particular station, or that particular project. There is, working with a very local NGO in terms of doing biodiversity monitoring, and I don't remember the details of that group. I think that there's some European support that's been going into them, but it's very much Peruvians that are on the ground doing the monitoring, especially of primates in that particular area.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to something that really concerns me about all this. I mean, I think primates are great. But the iceberg with respect to biodiversity. Yeah. And that doesn't seem to be built into this whole red network at all. That there's any kind of capacity building for the ability to assess more and more aspects of biodiversity over time. I think that's critical.
I think there's a whole lot of capacity building going on, but it's much more around carbon and remote sensing. And relatively little around biodiversity, and again, that's because what's the focus of RED?
Well,
and
something I was interested. I mean,
it's
you talked about it. It's an interesting contradiction in terms.
No, I agree.
The success of it depends on.
I agree.
Right?
It does. It does absolutely, and I agree with you. I would say that I would not start that statement about local monitoring capacity with "they need a research station."
Well, let me put my 2 bits worth into this. I've spent 50 years working in Peru, and I can say that there are competent and experienced Peruvians who can do the monitoring, but they have no way to make a livelihood. Nearly all of them have to make a livelihood doing something else because they can't do biodiversity work. There's simply no jobs in Peru to do that, except doing environmental impact statements for mining operations and other similar massive infrastructure projects, which thankfully, according to Peruvian law, do require a rather comprehensive environmental impact statement. So that is the source of employment for people who have these skills. But other than that, that's pretty much the end of the story.
I agree, and I just wanted an observation that maybe people could comment on is that when Steve put up the numbers of projects in various countries, I was saying this to him, I was interested that the country that was at the top was Brazil. And I completely agree with John with this, that there are no opportunities in Peru. And then you go across the border in Brazil, and now you have a country that probably has 40 or 50 universities that are hiring biologists left and right. And I think it's actually indicative of the number of reds that are there just because there's an academic community and things like that are really pushing to help do a better job. And so I guess that's my interest in this, is this academic capacity building is critical to, I think, long-term success in countries like Peru.
Absolutely.
It helps having your own space agency, too.
I wanted to ask Mr. Penfield about the idea of using CCB standards to measure and monitor performance in deforestation and for preservation. And these standards have a biodiversity component. And I'm wondering what's the incentive for any country or any land manager, land owner to want to use these standards? Because I guess in the carbon abatement world, in theory, there's an economic incentive to have carbon credits that you could sell potentially. I don't think it's working right now, but I mean, at least there's a so is there an incentive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the whole so there's no carbon price. There's no single price that says what a ton of carbon is worth. There are different sorts of schemes that have been set up. Like I mentioned, the European Union's emissions trading scheme, which doesn't take into account any of these forest carbon activities. And these forest carbon projects are going into this over-the-counter voluntary market, which means you're just trying to go out there and find somebody who's willing to give you some money for what you're doing. All of those buyers that participate in that market are doing it. I mean, they've got different reasons. In the case of somebody like Disney, it's they may inherently feel like it's the right thing to do to be supporting these forest conservation projects in areas of high biodiversity. And in other cases, there may be a more cynical view that it's just something that's good for their corporate image. But I think that's so on the buyer side, there's this range of things that do help steer. If you're just trying to reduce greenhouse gases, doing it from capturing methane out of a landfill would be good enough. But if you can do that and at the same time provide these co-benefits, it becomes more attractive for some buyers.
But it might be less attractive for the local. I mean, it's for the local community and for the local government to say, well, what are we going to get? I mean, under the CDM mechanism, we can get assistance for abating carbon dioxide.
Mm-hmm.
What do we get for spiders
Uh-huh. Well, and so there's a hope that you can actually generate and some of these projects are doing it with the expectation or hope that they can get a better price because they're doing it with these biodiversity benefits. Whether or not that's actually happening or happened is pretty difficult to tell. And I guess my own feeling is that there's actually more. It's sort of similar to the timber certification schemes, which in the end haven't really resulted in price premiums for FSC certified timber, for example, but they do in some cases open doors and buyers that wouldn't consider buying non-certified timber or carbon are willing to do it, even if the price isn't better.
So would you consider one of these potential issues of red that sort of, just for value, that goes into other areas, unintended consequences. I was fascinated by your maps of Tanzania because those Miambo woodlands remind me of the Cerrado in Brazil.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I'm wondering, could you make an argument that the focus on red, depending on how you, if you exclude those forests, actually begins to make them less valuable in the minds of
I don't think red will exclude those forests.
Okay.
If Tanzania has anything to say about it, there's no way, because that's the only way Tanzania is coming to the table at all, because otherwise it's got those tiny little bits. Now, red is not trying to exclude those. What I was trying to show with those maps is that even applying the safeguard is problematic. What Tanzania and any country like it will do is it will do its calculation based on what it knows about carbon stocks in Miombo and land use change in Miombo, and they will have some fantastically pessimistic reference scenario, and they will then improve on that. And I mean, it's going on everywhere, and their calculations will be smaller than the DRC having an even more pessimistic reference scenario because its biomass is bigger. But no, it's all on the table. At some point, I presume some South Sudan is potentially becoming a UN red country. Okay? Yeah, but I mean, it's nobody's out of the picture until they decide that it's not worth it to them to be in it. I think that's fair, as long as you're developing.
So it's interesting. So as long as you're developing, so at what point does Brazil cross over?
When it becomes an Annex 1 country, which it isn't yet. Basically. And it won't. No.
My question is for Dr. Wilcox, if I pronounce it correctly.
Yes.
The conservation and protection of endangered species work that you did, is that still ongoing? Someone else doing it since you moved on to Princeton? And what are the results? And I know that the eagle came off the endangered species list, I think, about 7 years ago? And recently we had an issue here in Chicago where they were going to put up a gun range in an area. And while they were out there exploring and looking at the area, an eagle landed. And they said, oh, wow, no, we can't put the gun range out here. Right, everybody was so happy that that eagle made his presence. Is that ongoing? Is that something you didn't say?
So I spent about 16 years before I went to Princeton working on endangered species issues. And the area that I probably, at the end, devoted the most time on was the issue of endangered species on privately owned lands. And the question was, you could get a law like the Endangered Species Act to prevent landowners from doing harm to those endangered species, whether it's shooting them, poisoning them, or destroying the habitat. But what incentive would a landowner have to do anything good for endangered species, to restore habitats for them, to try to build their populations? Because in theory, the outcome of that would just be more regulatory restrictions on your land. So we spent quite a bit of time on this dilemma working with the Fish and Wildlife Service and state wildlife agencies, and we were fairly successful in getting the Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal agency in charge of endangered species, to adopt a policy that essentially says if you do something for endangered species that you're not required to do, that goes well beyond your legal obligations, like create new habitat for them to build their populations, if down the road you decide that you can no longer sustain that activity, that now you need to develop the property or something like that, we're going to let you do it, notwithstanding the fact that you have now got endangered species on that area of land that you restored. And the argument was, if you don't give them that assurance, the landowners will never do anything for the endangered species. And if you give them that assurance, they'll do something good, and maybe they'll keep it that way. They won't feel the need to develop it. And even if some feel the need to develop it, others will continue to maintain it. And there were two interesting lessons I drew from that, because the program proved to be phenomenally successful. The first was that the level of participation by landowners was a lot greater than I expected. So there are, at least in this country, I don't want to talk about other countries, but there are a large number of landowners for whom having an endangered species isn't Armageddon. It's even something they like, but they do worry about the legal ramifications. And the second is how deeply upset, at least at the beginning, many of my fellow environmentalists in other groups were of that idea. Because they looked ahead to a time when there were endangered species on these properties that had been enhanced, and now the landowner was going to develop that habitat, and that troubled them greatly. And out of it, I came to believe that we probably should be more respectful of short-term victories and value them a bit more than we do, because sometimes that's the best you're going to get, and I have a feeling a lot of these short-term victories may ultimately become long-term victories. We had very few landowners, I can't think of any, who ever actually went back and developed their property. It wasn't that they were anticipating doing that. They just didn't like to think that they couldn't. So it was an interesting experience for me.
And just one other real quick one. As a result of those habitats being developed, the bulldozer coming through, and now you've got a shopping mall where there was once a wildlife habitat. Is it reasonable to assume that this is why we're seeing so much wildlife coming into the urban areas?
That's a good question. Now, I actually think there's something else going on here, and I would welcome the input from my colleagues. I think the reason, and I certainly in my lifetime, I've been struck by just what you say. So, for example, when I was a kid, there weren't even crows in urban areas. They stayed away. There certainly weren't wild turkeys. I remember it was quite a thrill to see wild turkeys. You had to get pretty far out into the undeveloped area. Now they're kind of a suburban bird in my part of New Jersey. We've had black bears in Princeton, which was unheard of. Things like that. I think we're seeing couple of things happening. The first is there's less and less hunting. There's just fewer people hunting. So some of these animals are just less worried about being around people. And they've discovered that if you're a crow, being in a city is a pretty good place to be. It's a safer place in some respects than being out in a rural area where there may be more people hunting and target practice and stuff. The second is, I think some of our urban environments have actually sort of improved for wildlife. There have been more trees have gotten older. This is more in the suburbs, I think, than in the actual urban core. So it's one of the more striking events that I've seen in the natural world over my life, and one that I actually welcome, because with fewer and fewer people actually going out into the wilderness, it's sometimes the only connection that people have with wildlife is what they can see in the suburban parks and city parks around them. That's my guess, but I would be intrigued with what you folks feel is happening to explain that?
Well, I grew up as a hunter in Virginia, and when I was at that stage, crows were varmints, and we shot at everyone that came within range. And I wasn't alone. There were hundreds of other kids walking around the countryside with guns, and really you don't see that much anymore. I mean, it's not just that the formal hunting has gone down. This sort of casual hunting being done by teenage boys, it's not as common as it once was. But I think it's a slightly different topic, but mammals have benefited greatly from absence of top predators, decline in hunting. So what we're most conscious of are mammals, deer, woodchucks, and more increasingly feral hogs, raccoons, possums, and all these things. Birds are suffering, and it may be that there's cause and effect there. The mammals are increasing in abundance, and they're impacting the birds, because what we're seeing is birds going down and mammals coming up. So that brings in another set of conservation issues and challenges that are more related to the kinds of things that I talked about.
And consistent with your top-down perspective on ecosystems.
I have a technology question for the panel. I mean, one can argue that the RED program, the RED protocol would not be possible without technology. So I'd like to ask the panel, what do you think are the large technology, data, software issues that you've experienced, that you've come across, that these issues that need to be solved for RED and also just, sustainability as a whole?
Well, let me, as probably the least technologically sophisticated person on this panel, let me say that from my perspective, the ability to use remotely sensed data to get a feeling for land cover changes has been extraordinary. It's, a graduate student in front of a computer today with a little bit of a budget to access some remotely sensed data can do the type of analysis that probably would have taken a small army of people a few decades ago. And that's, I think, given us a heightened vigilance about the changes that are happening, and given us a spatial dimension to our understanding of the problem. We can actually see how many forest tracts above a certain size threshold are left, and that sort of thing. So that to me has been an empowering aspect for our ability to understand the drivers of land use change. And I would hope that those data would become increasingly accurate, fine scale, and cheaper as we move into the future.
And frequent.
And frequent, yes.
And consistent. Sorry,
Yeah.
we still don't actually, at big picture scale, have good land cover change products. We have raw data, and we have remote sensors who always want to analyze it a better way the next time, which means you can't compare it with the last time. Mm-hmm. It's one of the great frustrations of my life that I spend a lot of time trying to put together off the shelf land cover change synthesized data, and they're not there because the new mousetrap was more attractive.
That's true.
So that's
but
incompatibility of data sets.
Yeah. So my big plea, if you're looking for sort of software and technological advance, is back calibrate. Fine, do it newer and better, but tell us what it means compared to in relation to the last one.
We're in a technology catch-up situation because the technology's going way ahead. There's a person out at Stanford, Greg Asner, who said who's developed remote sensing to an extraordinary degree so that he can recognize areas that have been selectively logged at the rate of 1 tree per hectare, and he can distinguish those from unlogged areas. And he's developed a highly sensitive spectrometer to read the reflectance from tree crowns to detect where gold mining is going on in a hidden way underneath the forest canopy versus places where it's not going on. You can tell in the reflected spectrum of the leaves. The technology is there, but as you say, there's just the
Appropriate deployment.
financing to bring it,
Yeah, financing and appropriate
the
deployment.
need up to where the technology is still not.
And there's a non-technology piece to that that's really missing, which is getting that information quickly into the hands of the people on the ground that can make use of it. And there are, there are some of these near real-time monitoring programs that are underway right now that are trying to do that, but they're still far too few.
Well, there's also some very interesting South-South learning going on. So Brazil is busy training the Congolese in their real-time deforestation detection. And that's really promising. It's a question of whether the computers will keep working in Kinshasa. But
Do I have time for a 30-second rant?
your turn.
Okay. Which is, notwithstanding that incredible new source of information, more and more people, I get the sense, are doing their dissertations, doing their research as data miners, where their field site is the computer, and fewer of them are actually getting into the field. And I think that's actually a dangerous trend, because to really have a sense of an issue in a way that enables you to do truly conservation relevant work, you've got to get out there. You've got to see the landscape, and you've got to have some contact with the people who are transforming that landscape, or you are going to be producing those sorts of Brazil should do the following type recommendations.
Really
that are,
bad models around.
yeah, that are just not sensitive to the real world context. So I think we need to view it as an incredible tool, but at the same time, it cannot substitute for people actually getting out into the field.
So I was really taken by the gap you mentioned, which I definitely felt as an undergrad as well. I was wondering if any of you guys could talk about, either from the science or policy, on when that gap has been bridged pretty seamlessly, or if you can envision how it could be bridged seamlessly. And I don't know whether that looks like more organizations coming into play, or I don't know.
Seamlessly?
more seamlessly than other
It's shrunk in some areas. But I mean, I kept jumping up and down about IPCC, and I don't think IPCC is the answer because it produces reports that are this thick. But at the same time, that process, which has been science getting together and actually saying we are consciously trying to inform policy, means that, in fact, there is a brief for policymakers that comes out of the big reports. It's about that thick, which is still too thick. But, you know, that, and the fact that they've actually educated their audience to expect to see confidence intervals around predictions and that sort of thing. You know, the gap's not completely bridged, but there's been a lot of progress.
One useful step in that, this is my idiosyncratic view, will be when graduate students, postdocs, and young faculty paint their faces blue and storm the offices of science and nature and tell them to stop only publishing in the field of conservation science these damn global assessments. Degree to which the oceans of the world are screwed up, degree to which the forests of the world are screwed up. The reality is...
Damn, there goes my next paper.
The reality is the solutions to these problems are going to be very site-specific. And as the premier journals downplay the value of site-specific, solution-oriented research because it is not broadly applicable, it turns people away from that sort of work. There isn't the same academic reward. So academics who sensibly say, well, where do I need to publish to have a prosperous career and such, see that it's these sort of meta-analyses, broad, sweeping sorts of things, and don't get the rewards if they could actually figure out what would be the way to correctly target a RED program or a reserve design program in the Usambara Mountains in Tanzania in a way that would create a lasting, durable conservation victory. Until those journals recognize that kind of work as tremendously important and successful, we'll have a problem bridging the gap because the incentive structure won't be there.
How about if we tell them there'll be many fewer authors on the paper?
Many fewer what?
There'll be many fewer authors on the paper if you let them do that. So I just want to make a plea along the lines of what David was saying with respect to biodiversity too. I mean, we have the capacity now with genetic tools and things to assess biodiversity in difficult to study groups in ways that we never could before. And at the same time, there's an issue with you try to publish basic faunal inventories and nobody's interested in it. And yet that stuff is sorely needed, and we have a better capacity to do it at some level than we ever have before. We just need to get people that see it as a value and are willing to go into careers in it.
With the biodiversity requirements that are in right now, and saying that, I believe that was stated that you have to provide what's already there, correct? So with the conservation efforts right now, so with providing what's already there, and is it possible that these biodiversity requirements are in a way artificial, and the biodiversity that is provided is artificial, is detrimental in a way comparative to what is the actual biodiversity than what was there previously?
I'm not sure if I fully follow you. So the requirement is, first of all, come up with some description of what's there at the beginning of the project. And then you do have to make some sort of description of the scenario of if there were no project, what would happen to biodiversity. So that's the tricky part, and that's tricky part with carbon as well, because we're trying to make some forecast about the future, and we can try to do that in more credible ways, but inevitably we're going to be wrong. It's a question to what extent are we wrong.
So are you right? So are you comparing? At the beginning, are you going between zero biodiversity and biodiversity in general, or are you comparing the biodiversity at the point in the beginning and trying to replicate the biodiversity?
Well, with the CCB standards, the requirement is that you, through project activities, biodiversity ends up better off than it would have been without the project. So in some cases, if you start with, in some of these reforestation projects, they show the before project picture, and it is totally denuded, bare ground. And in that case, even if they've only planted a handful of native species, they've done something that's positive for biodiversity in comparison to that without project scenario. In the case of a RED project, it may be that biodiversity, even with the project, is not better than it is today, but you have to make the case that it is better than it would have been without your project.
Is there a concern that people are going to come up with a fake
Oh,
baseline?
yeah, absolutely. and that concern isn't, people don't get too worked up about that on the biodiversity side, because the biodiversity is really peripheral. The big concern there is on the carbon side, and there is certainly an incentive there to come up with an artificially, a baseline that inflates your carbon benefits. So to some extent there is an incentive to do that for biodiversity, but what's paying for these activities is the carbon.
So I know with RED, one of the big issues is land title, especially for indigenous communities. It's a really really steep challenge, and I'm just curious from the panel, what kind of progress has the international community made in approaching that?
Depends on which country you're talking about. Slightly sensitive issue, but I mean, on the whole, because it's on the table and people are talking about it, I think it is progress. Because it's become an issue in a way. There's another reason for it to be an issue rather than just rights. You know, there's one more, for lack of a better word, marketplace. It's not necessarily a market, but there's one more conversation which is asking the question, who has rights to this land? You know, but it's not just that there is an interesting issue, particularly for Indigenous people, because there's land rights and then there's carbon rights. And those two are not necessarily the same. So, you know, if you are the steward for the carbon, and you're making sure the forest stands, but it's federal land.
Well, I have attended a number of events of this type at other colleges and universities, and there seems to be a much broader spectrum or attention put on biodiversity outside of the United States than here. Are there some anomalies or something involved that interferes with it getting the attention that it probably deserves? And because there's such a huge environmental movement in this country geared towards that. Does that make sense?
Well, it's partly because there is such an active environmental movement here, and there isn't quite such a strong environmental movement elsewhere, and particularly because at the moment what we're talking about is the stuff that is linked to the deforestation argument, which is very specifically targeted at developing countries. Under the Climate Change Convention, countries are split into two groups, which are the industrialized countries who can't manipulate their land use change and expect to be compensated for it because they're emitting so much through their industrialized processes. And the non-industrialized countries, the so-called Annex II countries, and that's the focus of this particular discussion about deforestation in the context of climate change. It's not about conservation not being important in the US, it's just that for this particular source of conservation-related resources, the US isn't on the table.
So
the US is putting the resources in, potentially, to compensate for its emissions, maybe.
Maybe.
like maybe develop some kind of, like in community gardening, some kind of MOU or memorandum of understanding. Okay, guys, here's what we have. We put this on the table and that on the table. It's more complicated than I probably imagined.
I have a question, David, about kind of your thoughts on the roundtable. I'm interested in how the incentives of certification have kind of come about, or been, what people think the trajectory might be. I'm wondering if this works and membership levels increase, was the value of membership potentially collapse per member? Are there plans to create tiers within the RSPO in order to kind of combat that? Are they thinking about, I guess I was kind of thinking how much more valuable in terms of sustainability might it be to encourage minimal membership with the hopes of creating some kind of sanctioned monopoly in order to reduce rates of conversion?
So, when last I looked at it, the future of the roundtable on sustainable palm oil was at best uncertain. Now, as is often the case in these sorts of dialogues, they tend to be driven to the lowest acceptable standard by the most recalcitrant participant. And so it's unlikely that the RSPO is going to create a standard that is so high that most of the aspiring companies can't meet it, because most of those companies will push to drop the standard down to a level that they can meet. They're struggling with that now, and they face two problems. The first was at least a few years ago when they started to get the first crops of certified oil palm fruits coming off the plantations. The idea was that they could sell them with a modest premium, and that would in turn be the reward to the companies for the certification. But in fact, even though the price premium they were asking for was relatively modest, nothing approaching the organic premium that you or I pay when we go into the supermarket looking for organic lettuce or blueberries, nothing like that, they couldn't sell it. So that part of it looks dodgy. Second, as I said, over this battle over standards, at least as of a year or so ago, I think Indonesia either was threatening to or had actually pulling out of the RSPO. Again, for fear that they were going to ask for too much. So that makes me uncertain what they'll be able to accomplish. On the other hand, counterbalancing that is the fact that some of the big purchasers of palm oil are sort of multilateral companies multinational companies with stockholders in the Western Europe, Australia, United States, and those companies have proved to be more sensitive than I would have expected to consumer pressure and stockholder discontent. And so, for example, Nestle was targeted, and if you go onto YouTube, you can sort of look for this. It's a Kit Kat oil palm commercial, but it basically, if you remember the structure of the Kit Kat bar, it's 4 connected pieces of chocolate-covered wafer which you can break off. And it was someone at an office trying to have a snack at midday, opening a Kit Kat bar, and instead of it being 4 rectangles of chocolate, it was 4 orangutan fingers. And he breaks one off, bites into it, and blood starts pouring down his face. That was produced by Greenpeace, and it was put on the web. They didn't even buy any television time for it. It went viral, and like that, Nestle's backed off and announced that they would only buy certified palm oil.
So is that the moment at which it's best to think about increasing your standard?
Well, it's a balance for them, because if they increase it too far, bear in mind, Nestle's isn't the biggest purchaser of oil palm. It's Chinese and Indian companies. So it's a real delicate balance for them. And I think they're going to figure it out by trial and error, and that will determine ultimately how important certification is. But I also would say that I'm hopeful that there will be a second line of pressure akin to that on companies like Nestle's, any of the major purchasers, that says, certified or not, don't get oil palm from companies that are continuing to clear forests. And maybe that type of pressure will also help the RSPO counterbalance the weight from its more recalcitrant members. So I think you're just going to see this sort of dance back and forth as they try to shake out. Would that match
Yeah.
your expectations? Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
I was wondering if, do you have more questions?
Yeah, just one more. I was wondering if this is, are you afraid that this is going to happen with any of the programs, or if it is, that areas that are preserving biodiversity that it has less carbon, like, I'm not sure the numbers, but I assume, a savanna might preserve less biodiversity than a really primary forest. Are you afraid that some of those areas that should be preserved in their own right will be turned over?
Yes, that's what we're talking about when we talk about indirect land use change.
Oh, okay.
The idea, so there's one question which is, if I stop deforestation here, do I get deforestation there? And in a carbon sense, theoretically that's covered by properly working REDD+ safeguards. In a biodiversity sense, that's much less true. And we're seeing that in Brazil. That to the extent that there are strong disincentives for deforesting in the Amazon and in the Atlantic forest, we have massive agricultural development in Cerrado. I mean, it's not that straightforward, and it's virtually impossible to demonstrate. We're going to have that conversation.
Yeah.
The ILUC conversation.
Yeah.
ILUC, I actually had a fairly acronym-free talk. I was really proud of myself. Indirect land use change, ILUC. That's the big one. And in terms of biodiversity impact, it's particularly difficult. I mean, it's very difficult to say, oh, this pixel, this bit of land has had a change in land use because something was done over there. That's really, really difficult to track.
I guess what I was afraid of too is like a place that, not for agricultural reasons, but would be changed to conserve more carbon, but on its own is a natural high diversity hotspot.
Yeah, but that's what I mean.
That's the same.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's building a suburb, or whatever. If you're restricting what you can do with land here for carbon reasons, then there's a reasonable chance that whatever was going to be done here is going to have to be done somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that there is a possibility that it will be exactly where you don't want it to be from a biodiversity standpoint.
Yeah.
But it's very, very hard to show.
I think the challenge in all of this is you can probably construct plausible scenarios that would paralyze you from going forward with anything.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that in turn means you accept a status quo that we all know is bad.
Yeah.
So my sense is we ought to be willing to take reasonable risks,
Absolutely.
accept the fact that there will be successes and some failures, and prepare the world for the fact that those failures do not necessarily invalidate the whole endeavor.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'd go with that.
I have one more question about biodiversity. I promise it's a lot more informed than my last one. So if one were to replicate the conditions of whatever biodiversity, how important would the microbiome be? And how much of a role would it play?
You heard the term charismatic megafauna? They're the fuzzies and the cutes and the cuddlies. I haven't heard the term charismatic microbiota. Really, really important in a functional sense. Very, very hard to get people excited about.
Yeah.
So you hope that you can tack it on to the stuff that people do get excited about. It is important, but it's going to be very, very difficult to get anybody discussing it substantively, I would say. I don't know if anybody else agrees with me, but sure. And I have a colleague who's forever going, yeah, but what about the nematodes? Really hard.
Yeah. In principle, these ideas, generating multiple benefits,
Yeah.
is open to, any sort of.
In principle.
But whether you're going to get someone that, or a country that says, well, we've done great things for our nematodes.
Yeah, exactly.
It's.
Or buyers. I mean, no company is going to put nematode on their annual reports and we protect it, and they should, but when you're looking at the voluntary market, it's harder so.
I'm kind of talking about like vegetation. So if you didn't have the microbiome, how different would
Okay.
the diversity of vegetation be?
be very important.
It's probably really important, and that's one
We
of the...
know so little about
Yeah.
it.
But I wonder if one possibility is that a good functioning RED program would serve to take the pressure off the forests whose soils are least able to sustain exploitation onto forests that are more able to sustain exploitation, which would then redound to the benefit of soil health.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a big question around soil carbon at all,
Sure.
which is also microbiota dependent. So, important point, we don't know a lot of the answers about the relationship between microbial biodiversity and the rest. And there are people working on it.
Well, thank you for great questions, and thank you very much to our panel for